Hey guys, Average Joe here, and I'm going to go over an installation and troubleshooting video. I'll try not to make it too long, but it's going to be a lengthy video. I'm going to go over all the components, what you should expect, how to put this together, and also how to troubleshoot it once you've put it together. This advice applies whether you have an OEM setup and you haven't upgraded any of it. Same rules apply. Or if you've upgraded it with my disc fix kit or my new locking pins, same rules apply. It also is the same whether you have 552 Series 1 or Series 2 or the 1090. The assembly is the same. The troubleshooting is the same. It's just different models for the design. So let's go over the components, and then I'll get into the assembly. This will become sort of the official assembly video. There's nothing more that I would need to explain after this. So if you're in need of assembly and troubleshooting, this will be the video to go to. Now, let's go over some of the naming. I use names that I created. I have no idea what the manufacturer calls these different parts. So anyway, 552 Series 1 is a hollow shaft with a threaded end, and then it uses bolts with lock washers and nylon washers to fasten the assembly together. 552 Series 2 and 1090 have a solid shaft with a threaded end, and they use nuts to hold the assembly together. But they are all around 18-19 millimeter sockets. So in some cases I found that 13/16 fits best, but in other cases with other nuts that they've used, I use 19 millimeter. So part of it is because I don't think they consistently sourced exactly the same size bolt for everybody. Unfortunately, that means you're going to have to figure out what size socket you need for your particular bolts on your set. I call this the selector dial because it is the thing you use to select your weights. These I refer to as my disc fix kits. There are 4 to a kit, 16 pieces, 4 packs like this to a kit. It's enough to upgrade 2 dumbbells. Individually, I like to refer to these as retainer discs, and I do that because if you look at the way they're designed, when you have your plates in your base and the plate comes in and you rotate your discs, that's how the disc gets retained in your dumbbell frame. When you rotate your discs to release the plates, that is how you're able to take your dumbbell handle out of the base. Okay, when these discs, the OEM version of these discs begin to fail, so these guys right here, when they begin to fail, that's why you're dropping weights. I've covered that in other videos. Now, this is just a stamped steel plate that has a bunch of detents on it and ball bearings with springs that are used to create the incremental click that you hear as you turn this handle. When it goes click, 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 what you're hearing is the ball bearings moving from one position to the next on this plate. You'll see about, I've seen maybe 6 different versions of this plate. They probably sourced it from different manufacturers. They're slightly different looking, but they function the same way. Then this I refer to as the crossbar assembly. I call it that because this bar crosses over all your plates. I don't know what the official name is, but this, when you hear me say crossbar assembly, I'm talking about this whole thing together as one unit. It contains your springs, your ball bearings, your plate, your locking pin, some nuts, and the screws and plates on the back side. There are a lot of components in this. Now, I'm going to show you while I'm at it here how to upgrade the locking pin assembly. Oh, I have some grease in there, so this thing's not going to, these aren't really going to fall out. But what I do first is take this steel plate off, and I make sure that the ball bearings are set aside. Then, oh, and these springs, if your springs are falling out, set them aside. Put your fingers over these holes, because that's the nuts for the locking pins. Fingers over the holes, flip it over. Take your 2mm Allen and spin your screws, 2 of them, until they're fully disengaged. Once you do that, you'll be able to pop this plate out with the 2 screws on it and put it aside. Inside here, you'll see the spring, and you will see the OEM pin, which is plastic. So you grab your new pin, continuing to hold your fingers on the back, okay? Grab your new pin, drop it down into the cavity, put your spring back in, put your plate back on, hold it with your finger, take your Allen. Do not over tighten these. There's no reason for you to over tighten them. If you do, you could risk breaking the plastic beneath it. So just snug, that's it. As soon as they seat, you'll feel it. That's it. Now, this is in. That was nice and simple. Flip it over. Now these aren't going to fall out because they're bolted together. And there is your locking pin. Testing it, you can see that it fully retracts when the button is depressed. Okay? Now, this assembly is done. You do this repeated again here, and your locking pins are upgraded. Next up is, oh, and the last component here is the handle. You've heard me say that we're going to make a new version of the handle. That's because some people hate this curve. They don't like this curved body. They prefer the straight handle of a gym style dumbbell, a traditional dumbbell handle. Also, this rubber, while it might have been a nice idea, it eventually peels up. I mean, you can see it's not even connected really to the metal. It peels up and it begins to stretch out and rotate, and it's just a pain. I don't like it. We're going to do a straight pro style traditional dumbbell grip. Same thing for the 1090. A lot of people don't like these flat sides. This is a very unusual handle to hold. So we're going to make a round pro style version of that grip as well. And the last thing I should mention before beginning assembly is that you will see so many different types of washers. It's as if, you know, the company was buying whatever washers fit. They didn't have any consistency in their types of washers in the assemblies, and some of these washers can get pretty beat over time. They are a 16mm inner diameter on the 5.52. I believe on the 1090 it's like a 20.5mm, and they are about a 0.5 millimeter thick, and they're various kinds of plastic. Some of them seem to be like a nylon, but they are used on the bolts, you can see here, and more importantly, they're used on the crossbar assembly. When you take your dumbbells apart, you should see a washer inside here like this. Whether it's this style or that style, you should see a washer, and it probably has grease on it. That's so that this thing can slide on this assembly. So when you take these off, don't dry them off. Put them back on with grease. If you do dry them off, add some grease back on. So here's a dab of just regular, whatever kind of grease you have, bearing grease. Put a little bit on your plastic. Okay, it just needs to be a film. You're not trying to you know, create a huge amount of grease on here. Put your washer, and you can put a little bit also on this part. So I'm greasing this and the other side. And then you take, now I've got my ball bearings in here with grease. It's something that I've done. You can assemble it however you want. I've shown in previous videos how you can put some grease on here and here and put your ball bearings on top, and they'll stay in place. However you do it, whatever works best for you, okay? But make sure your washer's in place. Make sure you've got grease on both surfaces, and then put your plate back in place. So let's see here. I want that. One sec here. Okay, so this assembly is now back together. You can feel the springiness of the plate. It's been greased, the washer's in there, that one's ready to go. Same thing on here. Now you can see in this one I already have the ball bearings sitting on the springs. However you want to do it. Put your grease on that surface, put your washer, get your other component, put your grease on that component, just a light film, that's all you need. Put this assembly together, and now those two are ready. So we're ready to do the complete assembly of this dumbbell. And as you've seen in a previous video, I start with my handle with the selector dial on it. I take my disc pack. Disc A is next to the selector dial. So I slide this down onto the shaft sector, and I rotate it around until I feel it seat in place. It will seat into this dial. You don't want it to be, you know, loose in here. These should be seated into the dial so that they don't turn. Then you take your crossbar assembly. That large slot goes on that large slot. So I orient it, and boom, it's locked in. Then take my handle, put that on, rotate it, and it locks in. Then take your other crossbar assembly, put it on, rotate it, and it locks into place. And you'll also notice that these two are positioned the same. Then you take your other disc pack, this time with disc D. This is D. Disc D. And you make sure all the discs are seated. When you buy these kits, they come shrink wrapped, ready to go for you to just slide on, but mine do not have shrink wrap on them, so they're loose. So, you know, this is how I put them on when they're loose. Look for the large slot on here. Slide this on, rotate, and you can hear it click in place. Now you've got the large slot on here on the selector dial, large slot on your retainer discs. Click in place. Now the trick for these, for putting this bolt on, is you can try to start it with your fingers like this. Whether it's the nut of this or the bolt of this, you try to start it with your fingers. But ultimately, you want to tilt this assembly, put your finger underneath and push up so that you can push the shaft all the way through the dumbbell, and that'll allow you to get the bolt or nut threaded most of the way on. And then once you've got that, you can put your ratchet on and snug it a little bit more. Now, right now, it's just snug. Some people tighten this way too much. Don't tighten it too much. I'll explain why shortly. Basically, once it's snug, take your ratchets, put them on each end, and just give about half a turn to a turn. So, boom, I've done about a half a turn with this ratchet. And that is it. You don't need to be any more tight than that in order to make this dumbbell function properly, okay? If you go tighter than that, you're going to cause problems. Now, we're going to take this base. This is a 5.2 Series 1 base. And I'm going to explain a couple things about this base. First is these plastic raised areas that you see here. These are what pushes the button in to allow your handle to rotate. When you lift your dumbbell out of the frame, that's why they don't rotate anymore. These metal tabs are a kind of a cool little feature for transporting your dumbbells. So, you know, when you have all your weights in here and your dumbbell handle is on here, you can do a little trick. The trick is put your dumbbell on one of these ribs, halfway between the numbers on both sides. Halfway between the numbers. And it locks your dumbbell into the base. So that when you're transporting this thing in a car with all the weights in it, the dumbbell handle doesn't fall out and all the plates fall out all over your car. Let's say if you took a corner too fast or something like that. So it locks it together just by putting the dumbbell selector dial in between two weights. When you move it to an actual weight setting, whatever that weight setting is, you'll notice it can now come out of the base freely. So that's a little tip for the future. Now, okay, why is it important not to assemble these things too tightly? Because this whole thing works on math. The dimensions from here to here, here to here are all specific. If you tighten this too much this way, you're going to throw off all the dimensions in here so that nothing is going to fit in this base or in the weights properly. This needs to sit right on this. If it doesn't, your handle is going to be a little up on one side. It won't be flat. This is flat. See, this turns freely. But if this dumbbell is slightly up like this, it's not going to turn. And in order for this to fit on the base properly and seat fully, this assembly needs to be together correctly. So the other thing is on the other side here on the selector dial, there's literally like a thousandth of an inch gap between the inside of this dial and the outside of this base. If this is too tight, you're going to get rubbing of this dial on the base. So as you're trying to turn this, it's going to be way too tight. You're going to be fighting it to turn it. In fact, you can see that I previously, at some point, had it too tight. I can tell because it's all the rubber in here is rubbed off. That's a sign that it has been, at some point in its life, rubbing on this base from being assembled too tightly. So if you find that you assemble the kit, you put in your lock pins, you've done it all correctly, you're ready to test, take all your weights out, just like I have here. Make it an empty base. Now, put your handle on the base. It should seat flat on the base, and these should turn freely. No rubbing, nothing weird. Okay? If you find that these are too tight, you're going, ugh, you know, you're trying to turn these things, you've got it too tight. The assembly's too tight. Back off slightly on the bolts or the nuts to loosen the assembly up a little bit. It should rotate freely on both sides with no weights in the base. Okay, and it should seat fully on both sides. If it's not, and it's doing this, and you can't turn it, it's because your assembly is not correct. Part of the problem is tightening, as I mentioned before. Tightening is important. You don't want to over tighten, but also you want to make sure that every single one of these components is seated fully in the previous component. So this is fully seated here, this is fully seated here, and so on. This is fully seated into this. That makes sure that all these distances are correct. You also want to make sure that inside here you have your washer. If you omit the washer, it's going to change the distance between this crossbar assembly and plate, which changes the distance here, here, all the way through it. It's a domino effect. So you want to make sure you have your washer, and don't just use any old washer. It has to be one that's about as thick as the original OEM washer if you use a replacement. I'm going to look into buying the correct size washers. They're not easy to get. That's part of the challenge here. If you lose your washer, it's not easy to get replacement washers, at least not in individual pieces. I can buy them in bulk of 1,000, 2,000 of these, but I'll look into getting some washers and possibly down the road including these in the kit, just in case people have lost their washers. But make sure your washers are in there, or it's going to throw off all your dimensions, which will make it, of course, not line up properly with your base. This is true for the Series 1, the Series 2, and the 1090. Let's see, what else is there? Crossbar. On the crossbar, you want to make sure that the bar is inside this groove. I've seen installations where this bar is out. It's out here. It doesn't belong out here. It belongs inside this groove. You want to make sure that this bar is riding inside that groove, and you can see here what the gap is. Again, it is very small. It's a couple thousandths of an inch gap between here and here. If you tighten this too much this way, it's going to crush this selector dial against the crossbar, and you're just going to end up with fighting this dial turning because they're too tight. So again, I cannot stress enough that the proper assembly revolves around making sure your washers are in place, seating everything properly, making sure the crossbar is in place, and not tightening your bolts too tightly. Once you've done that, once you've got everything assembled, now you can start putting your plates, of course, back into the frame, into the base. And then let's move around here, get all these babies back into the frame. Now we can test. The ultimate test, of course, is using this thing in the frame with the all the plates in. So you want to make sure, again, that that's funny. By the way, and I've done this a million times, despite having assembled these, I've lost count, but it's so easy to forget this, and I just forgot it. So do this. Make sure this is set on 5. If you don't set it on 5 and you're trying to put your handle down in, you're going to be forcing it down in there, and it's trying to go in, but it's not set on 5. 5 is the only way you're going to get your dumbbell all the way in. So depress your locking pin, rotate this around until you're on 5. Go on to the other side, make sure it's on 5. And now when you put your dumbbell into the base, you can see that, you know, it's on 5. And make sure your dials move freely all the way around, both directions. All of this should move freely. It shouldn't bind or anything like that. If you get any binding, make sure it's seated here, because this isn't going to move freely if this is not seated. Make sure it's both sides, by the way. Make sure that it's not too tight, because if it's too tight, then you're going to get difficulty to move. If you find that it's a little bit too tight, take your wrenches or ratchets and back it off just a little bit. Make sure that this is not too tight. And then, once again, test your dumbbells to make sure that it is, and you can go through, you know, all the weights. Just keep going through. And this is, by the way, flat. I recommend personally, to make it easier for you, to put a block under here and elevate this on one side. On a 552 Series 1, this is the most finicky set. It's the oldest. A lot of people have these, you know, 10, 15 years old. And there have been a lot of changes in their dumbbells, I'll discuss that in a minute, that make a 552 Series 1 a particularly finicky set. And so I recommend that they elevate one side of their base when they're using their dumbbells to make the upgrade work with their dumbbells more smoothly. 552 Series 2 and on the 1090, not really necessary. I mean, you can do it, elevate one side of the base. But I find that it's a lot less necessary based on the way that they redesigned their weights in their base. But anyway, so you go through, you know, all your weight settings and make sure that it's lifting out the weights that it should and not lifting out the ones that it shouldn't. And once you're satisfied with that, you know, you can begin using your weights. You just keep going through. So this, you know, is a properly assembled dumbbell. Oop. This is why you put it flat. They are so finicky. Let me try to elevate the base. So now, when you see how much more smoothly that just went in, it's because of the way that the 552 Series 1 was designed. With the tight tolerances that I have on these discs, you can see just now in the last 2 minutes, when I went to put the dumbbell back in with it flat at 30 pounds, it was a little more challenging. You know, I got it in, but it was a little more challenging. And when you're doing it at an incline, it goes in a lot easier. And it's just got to do with the way that, you know, this was designed versus the 552 Series 1 and 1090. Now, one last thing I want to cover is the plates themselves. So basically, these plates over time, they wear. They wear in a lot of different ways. On the Series 1 particularly, there's a seam that runs all the way around the plastic. And this seam will begin to crack or separate. And when it does, it actually causes issues in the base. It'll cause these plates to slide out when they shouldn't. It'll cause them to not go in smoothly when they should. If you have to, you can put super glue inside here and squeeze these together, and it'll, you know, repair that plate. But it is one of the problems with the older sets. Also, you'll hear people talk about broken tabs where this piece breaks right off. Underneath here is a steel tab that has, it's stamped in. It's actually a steel tab that is almost the same shape as this plastic covering. When this plastic covering breaks off, you can take a screwdriver, stick it in here, lift up, and just slightly, you don't need to do it a lot, but the steel tab will still be inside here. And so the plate is still usable, even though the plastic covering has broken off of it. So don't worry about that. You don't need to buy a replacement plate just because this plastic tab broke off. The other thing is, I've run into a couple people who had their plates were just worn in ways that they were misshapen. And if the plates are misshapen in here, you know, this assembly relies on these plates being normal. But if they're misshapen in any way, they will not fit properly between these openings. So if there's unusual wear on a particular plate and you find that it's just not functioning the way that it needs to be functioning, you should consider replacing it. One of the things that I'm hoping to do later this year, early next year, is to make an all-metal version of these plates, but not just like a copy of these plates. I actually want to make an all-metal version, no plastic covering, that will increase the weight of the dumbbells. So I'm hoping to turn the 552s into a 90-pound dumbbell, or as close to 90 pounds as I can get. And I'm hoping to turn the 1090 into a 120-pound dumbbell, or as close as I can get. We'll see. I can't tell you if I'll succeed. You'll kind of see me work on this along the way. But if I succeed and I can make them affordably, then I will offer an all-metal upgrade for the plates for those of you who are tired of dealing with this plastic crap. This is unfortunate. They should have just had all-metal plates from the start, but they chose to make a lot of this stuff in plastic. So anyway, that's it. Whether you have, you know, the 1090s or 552 Series 1 or 552 Series 2, you know, this is all the same procedure, same troubleshooting, and hopefully this video has helped you to understand some of the potential issues you could run into. We've had very few people that had any problem whatsoever with their upgrade not working with their dumbbells. On the 552 Series 2, we had one person, and that's already been resolved. In fact, he resolved it himself. On the 552 Series 1, we had 6 total people that had issues using their dumbbell in their weights, and 5 of them were related to the tightening and also kind of the age of their plates and their dumbbells. And once we went through and debugged it with them, now, you know, they'll be able to use their dumbbells normally. But so my point is that you know, you got to make sure you assemble these things correctly and test them out the way that you saw me test them out. And yeah, and then if you still have any issues whatsoever, you know, you can reach out to me and I will help you get it resolved. But otherwise, you know, hopefully you get a lifetime of use out of your disc fix kits and your upgraded locking pins. By the way, that's the locking pin upgrade on the 1090. So and you know, I've got about, I don't know, 1,000 of these that are made. So I'll begin announcing the locking pin availability as well for these dumbbells. Oh wow, 35-minute video. Sorry guys, it's that was pretty long, but hopefully I answered all your questions. If you have any other questions, let me know. I prefer email, it's easier. I don't go on YouTube often enough to answer questions in a timely way. So if you can, shoot it in an email, and otherwise, please, understand that it might be several days before I get to your YouTube questions. It depends on what we're doing, what we've got going on to get these things manufactured for customers. Thank you for watching, and in one of the upcoming videos, I hope to introduce the production pins that I've been telling you about, and also provide the pricing on those. So yeah, thanks guys. Have a great day. Be safe and healthy. Bye for now.